Good morning. You know, although I am full on a city boy, I'm still a southern city boy. And so that means every good southern boy knows that when he turns 100, he doesn't have to do what his mama says anymore. But until then, you do. And there's a couple of things when I go to restaurants now. If they have it, I ask for a cloth napkin, because when I grew up, we sat at the table, you buttoned your top shirt like this and stuck your napkin in so it didn't get on your clothes. And so that's one thing. Here's another thing. No good Southern boy would ever talk about sex in a mixed crowd. Now, I have been told that I'm somewhat archaic about that everybody talks about everything all the time, and that's probably true. So to help me out so I just don't completely crawl out of my skin, sex equals intimacy in this talk today. Because if I say it as many times as I'm going to say the word intimacy, I'll just melt right here in front of you. So that's the first disclaimer. Second disclaimer, we're talking about marriage today. We're beginning this series, 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And by the way, I don't want Randy to have a heart attack when he hears sex so much in, one sermon. So yeah. He says that's why he gave it to me. So I love to talk about intimacy. But this is a complex subject, and we're gonna. Honestly, I'm telling you, I realize I always have. I told somebody the other day that I was going to do this sermon in 35 minutes, and they said, "You've never done that in your entire life." Well, this is a complex teaching, and so I want you to hear my heart on this. As you're listening to what I'm saying, if you go, "Tim, but this and but that," I get it. This whole discussion about marriage is incredibly complex, about the intimacy relationships, about divorce and remarriage, and just all that stuff is so incredibly difficult. So honestly, if I had my preference, we would all go down on my front porch, sit in a rocker. Today, we would be bundled in blankets and having a very hot drink in our hand. But we'd be sitting out on the porch, three of us at a time, having this discussion. Because you'd have questions, and I'd have questions, and we'd say, "Yeah, but what about this and what about that?" So please understand, I'm not trying to create a whole theology of marriage this morning, but we want to look at the 7th chapter of 1 Corinthians and see if we can call out of it the main things that he has to say about this whole issue. The last thing I would challenge you to see is, you say, "Well, Tim, my marriage is good. We're not thinking about getting a divorce. None of that's happening." Okay. That's great. There's more to hear in this than just about whether or not you're getting a divorce or not, or whether or not your marriage is bad. So I want you to read with me. We're not going to read the entire chapter, but we are going to read parts of it. And so read with me beginning in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Today I'm going to do something I haven't done ever, I don't think. I'm reading from the New King James Version. And he starts like this. "Now concerning marriage, the things which you wrote to me about." So Paul, these folks had been asking him some questions about marriage and how that works and intimacy and so on. He says, "It's good for a man not to touch a woman." Randy talked about that last week. "Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. Let the husband render to the wife the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does." But that doesn't come up in everyday conversations. Here's another one that doesn't. "Do not deprive each other, except with consent for a time, that you may give yourself to fasting and prayer, and come together again, so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. But I say to you as a concession, not as a commandment, for I wish that all men were even as myself." We know Paul at this particular time appeared to be single. "Each one of us has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that. But I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it's good if they remain even as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, that means they're not involving themselves in intimacy outside the marriage. He says, let them marry. For it's better to marry than to burn with passion. Oh my. So there were these questions that they'd written. They were asking about marriage and holiness and all those kinds of things. And so I'll try to give you an idea of some of the kinds of things that they were talking about. But as you think with this today, think in terms of, we're not writing the all-exclusive manual on the theology of marriage. But what we're trying to do is talk about very practical matters. Again, I would prefer we would be sitting on my front porch with rockers, and you would be objecting to certain things. Do not check out on me today, because I promise you there's going to be something to say to give you a real point of encouragement. But the very first question that came up was intimacy or not. And just for the record, the word sex is in the Bible. It was just there. So intimacy or not. And I want you to understand the Corinthians were in a very interesting place with this, because first of all, they had the same, very similar culture to what we had, actually a little worse. They actually had people who would worship by going to the temple to have sex with a prostitute. But it was literally a sexually permissive and sex-crazed culture, much like some people would call our culture today. And so it's in that context that they got the idea, hey, look, there's a lot of that ends up being bad. And they'd heard teaching on this before. But the problem is they begin to think this, that abstinence completely, in or out of the marriage, was the thing to do. And so literally, they were holding themselves up as more holy and denying each other in their intimacy in their marriage. And another thing they would do is some people were divorcing their mates, thinking this idea that it's more holy to be single, that I can be more committed to God if I'm not involved in sexuality, and therefore if I'm married, I'm supposed to do that, so I'm not going to do that. Excuse me. And so being a celibate was more holy. And I want you to hear then what Paul says about this issue of intimacy, and then we'll move along. First of all, intimacy or not in a marriage? The answer is yes, yes, yes. It's it's supposed to, I like that guy. And one day he'll understand what we're talking about. Paul says absolutely. As a matter of fact, he says it's really important you understand that it's not supposed to be done outside the marriage, and that it's wrong. And watch, I know I'm not supposed to say this, but it is a sin to have intimacy outside of marriage. But it is great in marriage, would be the first thing he would say. Second thing he'd say is this, that it's not just that intimacy in marriage is good and you're not more holy if you abstain from it, or if you divorce your mate, which we'll get to in a minute, or not be married at all. But he says, my words, you should give your whole self to this. And that's really interesting. The reason I use the New King James Version today, because I think it captures best the translation there. And if you don't like that, then you can take that up with me later. But he carries with it the idea, he says, that every man should render, that means to give to, their mate, husband to wife, wife to husband, the affection due them. And you say, well, Tim, I thought intimacy, or I have to use the word sex, was more than just, affection. It's like the whole thing. Yes, it is. But the whole idea in this passage here is this is not just about a physical act of relationship between a husband and wife. That it involves much more than that. And so in proper terms, I want to describe this to me. That means men and women listen to this, although if I wanted to pick on the men, and I could pick on the men, I would say you need to listen more than your wives do, but you both need to listen. The idea here is that this is not just something I got to have so I can be relieved. This is something that I invest my time, energy, money, affections, emotions, thinking about it, my planning for this. Somehow this whole idea that romance is just this, everything's off the cuff. I'm telling you, it's not about those kinds of things. As a matter of fact, is there anybody in here, I'm not going to ask you to give a testimony about this, but is there anybody in here that has ever found that doing things off the cuff when you got kids is a little problematic? Can I get an amen? Yeah. And so the whole romance thing, it's just, we're just going to, whenever strikes our fancy. There aren't any times to strike your fancy when you have kids. And so there's this idea here about my whole self. He says it's not only good and right and holy and ought to happen in a marriage relationship, but I ought to be giving time, energy, effort, and dare I say romance to invest in this connection between myself and my mate. So it's not just that we actually participate in this beautiful physical relationship a certain amount of time, so it's not even about frequency. As a matter of fact, just as a side note, there's some solid research that I don't have time to cover this morning about people that have multiples of partners in the intimacy category get to where they mess up their emotions. They become disconnected and have an inability to connect to someone heart to heart. So if you want to go there, just go right ahead. Because it's not God's best. God's best for you is that He wants us to experience things in the physical relationship that are absolutely amazing. But he goes on, he even ups this attitude because he says this, not only is it good, and not only am I to give my whole self to it, but there's a new attitude to it. Now catch this. Normally this is what I hear when I hear I hear it from both men and women. But if you don't know, we've run for years a program for abused men and women, and I've worked with a lot of couples in marriage. And one of the things that I hear, and I've heard this in ultra-conservative faith groups, is, the Bible says your body's mine. And so it's time for us to have intimacy. And that's what the Bible says, and that's why it's going to happen. Is there anybody in here shocked that that's not the attitude? Can we just all agree that's probably not the first attitude? As a matter of fact, the attitude is exactly opposite that. It's not that you owe me as my mate, but that I owe Karen. Oh, well, that's way different. Because you see, I don't get to come to the relationship as a demander. I come to the relationship recognizing that there is something that I owe her, and of course for her, there's something that she owes me. And let me put that to you in context that is very important to me that doesn't have to do with marriage. On a pretty regular basis, because people know I've been here a long time, people say, Tim, you ever thought about going somewhere else? I owe you. This body has taken care of me when I was completely broken. And it doesn't mean God can't lead me somewhere else. But the truth is I owe this body. And I'll use, as long as He allows me to be here and to invest here, I will use my dying moments and energies to pay back what I owe you in Christ Jesus. Can you get the sense of that? How much more would that be in the relationship between a husband and wife? Excuse me. It's not coercion. It's not abuse. It is a binding obligation, but it's one that says this: I owe you. Now, by the way, do you know, I can't remember if it's happened, then someone can correct me later, but I never remember hearing couples, because I do hear couples that say, well, I'm not going to do anything with him, or I'm not going to do anything with her because I'm mad. I'm mad, and I just want to stay mad. I'll let you know when I'm not mad anymore. Somehow, that doesn't quite ring of the I owe you. Now, here's another thing. He says, never stop with the physical relationship. As a matter of fact, the word he uses there is the same word used for defrauding in Scripture. This is not just about frequency, but again, it's about the romance. And by the way, if you don't have any idea what I'm talking about when I'm talking about bringing your whole self to this, ask somebody. There's a lot of people around here that have got that right. And here's another idea, that the people in Corinth had this idea that they were showing great self-control by not engaging themselves in the marriage relationship and intimacy. But Paul basically says this: you are not showing self-control when you actually keep your physical relationship from your mate. Now let me say it in plain words. If you're mad at your mate and you're holding out, there's no self-control in that. The fact that you're not beating them to death is not self-control. The truth is, you're out of control because you've decided to remain angry and to punish your mate. And you're not yielding to the living Christ who would have you move in a different place. And finally this, he just says this, again closing it off about marriages, that, excuse me, it's better to marry than to burn in your passions. So if you happen to be single, intimacy or a physical relationship outside of marriage doesn't work. Singleness is a gift. And I had a fella ask me once, well, how do I know if I have the gift of singleness? I said, it's pretty simple. We aren't talking about just that I have an attraction for women or men. You know, and you say, well, if I have an attraction for women or men, I can't be single. No, this is if you can't control yourself. I'm not trying to be crude. That's just exactly what he's talking about. That it is impossible for you to go there, and you'll know it because you have the ability by God's power to remain chaste. Then he moves on to a second question. He says this: divorce or not divorce? Divorce or not divorce? Now again, remember this, the Corinthians thought they were more holy if they weren't involved in a physical relationship. And they even got to the point they were thinking, well, you know, it's just there's a lot of distractions in being married. Now, I'm not criticizing being married, nor was Paul. But there's a lot of distractions in being married. And so, you know, Paul even said, this is the Corinthians talking, Paul even said, you know, I wish you were like me. It's true I can be distracted by a lot of things in life, including my mate. But the truth is this, that the flesh is not bad, and being involved in a marriage is not bad. Excuse me. There's another thing that was going on at this particular time, the reason a lot of divorce was happening. A lot of men actually had adopted the culture. So there was one or two extremes. Some had adopted a culture that if you burned my supper, I could dismiss you for no reason in that culture. The other were taking the high and mighty. Now let me translate that to how that happens in today's culture. I have people, and I've had men tell me this and women tell me this, so I don't care, let the knife cut both ways, that tell me this, you know, my husband's just not spiritual enough. Or my wife, you know, she really doesn't run after Jesus the way I do. You know, it'd be a lot easier for me if I was just single, then I could really give myself to Jesus. I could give myself to the Christian faith and all that's involved that way. But I want you to read with me now. He says, now to the married I command, yet I do, not I, but the Lord. A wife is not to depart from her husband. But even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried and be reconciled to her husband, and a husband is not to divorce the wife. He goes on. But to the rest I say, not the Lord. If any brother has a wife who does not believe and she's willing to live with him, let him not divorce her. And a woman who has a husband who does not believe, if he is willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but now they are holy. But if the unbeliever departs, let him depart, and the brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases. Listen to what he says finally. For how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? The question is divorce or not. Well, he says no. I'm sorry, you probably didn't get that. It was a really complicated word. He says no to divorce. He says, but if you do go ahead and separate, so he has some allowance that we can debate all day long, but the bottom line, he says, there are some who will separate, but if they separate, they should remain unmarried or resolve the marriage. Now, there are some that are sitting in here, and I probably should have done this disclaimer to begin with. There are some sitting in here, and you may find yourself, you think, well, according to that very exacting standard, I'm toast. I might as well just get out now and be done with it. Please hang on. Please hang on. There's hope for what Christ does. And I also should let you know this, that those of you that might be thinking that I'm just speaking from a perspective about divorce that I don't know about, those of you are new to us and don't know. Karen and I have been together for over 20 years now, be married 17 years in May on the 18th, yeah. But the truth is the both of us experienced the very devastating nature of going through a divorce. And no, you don't get to know the details. If you're interested, we'd be happy to tell you personally. But I want you to see this. We've done that and raised 6 kids. Watch my lips. There's a reason God hates divorce. It is the most horrific, horrible experience you can ever imagine. And you can tell me, no, it's not. And you can tell me all the platitudes that go with this. But anybody that's been through it knows it's hell on earth. And so I want you to know that God hates it because of the destruction that's there. But let's go on with the passage. So he says, no divorce, but if you separate, you remain unmarried or resolved. He also says this with 2 believers. There is an exception. If there is unfaithfulness in the relationship, Paul says, or it says other places, because of the hardness of heart, excuse me, that I'll allow you to do this. But I want you to be clear about something. He doesn't say you have to divorce if there's unfaithfulness. He says that you may divorce. But one fella, quoting the divorce care tapes that we've been doing for many years, even before I came, is this: I have the right to divorce in this situation, but I always have the responsibility to love. And so the question ends up being, what is God calling me to in the middle of all this, and where am I in my walk with Christ? I want to be clear, when you start talking about divorcing someone, this is the reason given in Scripture that a person can divorce another individual. And by the way, newsflash, annoying, sinful behavior does not equal unfaithfulness. 2 believers also, he says this about 2 believers. And I want to give this explanation, and I speak on behalf of the eldership here at Tri-State. There's a category of abuse that is off the scale. Now, if I had time, I would talk to you about the kinds of things that people call abuse in our culture today. But frankly, sometimes in our culture today, people call abuse the fact that he is just annoying somebody, or she's hard to live with. Watch my lips. That's not abuse. And if you want to talk about this further, again, we don't want to leave you in this desperate place. But there are people who have, where the eldership has been about this for a great many years is this, and I'm going to quote Dr. Archibald again on the divorce care tapes. He says this: if the potential for murder or worse is implied from abuse, it kind of trumps the whole divorce thing. And I'm not trying to treat this matter lightly, but if you're dead at the end of what I do to you, it's kind of a permanent divorce, even though you didn't sign the papers. You get what I'm saying? I want you to understand that abuse is a horrifically horrible thing, and we do not view it lightly here. And so there are people who have been involved with Tri-State Fellowship that we have painstakingly tried to help restore their marriage, who have been in abusive situations. And we believe that they are in an impossible situation, that they have the freedom to do what they want to do. Now, if you want to discuss that further, but it's not, we're not making any excuses about our position, but just recognize, again, I caution you, being unkind is not abuse. Finally, he goes on, he says this about the a believer and the unbeliever. No divorce if the unbelieving mate will stay. I repeat this. No divorce if the unbelieving mate will stay. It's really interesting because as he goes on, he makes 2 very simple points, and I'm going to quickly go through these. But he says, the unbelieving mate will be sanctified by the believer, and the kids of the relationship will be sanctified by the believing mate. My dad married my mom, and I have 2 older brothers who are 8 and 10 years older than me. And for the first 10 years of her marriage to him, he was a raging alcoholic and a man who would not follow Christ. Now, he worked hard, provided for the family, made a whole bunch of money. And my mama is one of the most kind, or was one of the most kind, quiet, peaceful servant women you've ever met in your life. And for all those years, even before my brothers came along, she dealt with his alcoholism. Now, by God's grace, and again, don't get all complex on me and say, so Tim, you're saying that women who have alcoholic husbands or wives should stay with their mate even though they get beat up. That's not what I said. I'm telling you one example of one situation. Paul's point is this: as the unbelieving mate has the ability to be used by God as they are in this relationship to point that person and to draw them to Christ. And in the same way, to do the same for the children. Now, there are some that would teach this passage and say that as far as the children go, because of where the mate is they actually cover these children before they get to a place where they can make a decision about Christ. And I'm probably okay with that. But here's what I want you to see. Where else in the world are they going to see, if by God's grace you're able to remain, the squeeze that gets put on you, and for your children to see the amazing things that Christ does with a person is in a situation like that. Now listen, I know the world is not perfect and some crazy, crazy things happen, right? You bet. It's difficult. So don't go assuming anything that I've forgotten all that. But I want you to see this, that God says there's amazing things that can happen even if I'm living with the unbelieving person. Excuse me. Finally, God says this, or Paul says this: God has called you to peace. Now, I want to quickly say to you this. Do you understand that if you are a Christ follower and you're married, actually, if you're a Christ follower, period, that do you realize you can only be satisfied long-term with obeying God? Obedience. God gave you the commands in the Bible because the only way you can be satisfied is to obey. Now, I'm not saying sin's not fun for a season. Everybody agrees on that, right? But the truth is as a believer, you were created to enjoy obedience. I didn't say brainwashed. I said you were created to enjoy obedience. It's the core of who you are. And so I often tell people, if you don't believe me, go live like you're not a believer and see how that works for you. It won't work at all. You weren't designed for disobedience. You were designed for obedience. And so when I think about this issue, when he says, you were called to peace, that means I can find myself, and by the way, I'm speaking by experience, not by conjecture. For 18 and a half years, I spent time and invested time in my first marriage. And while I'm not going to go over the details of that in front of you, not because I'm embarrassed by it, because that is not my story to tell. This is my story to tell. When I was in the middle of all that, and my mate was doing hurtful things to me, I realized that there were days when I felt completely justified making her pay because she'd been so bad. Now, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, but in your mind, I'll ask you to raise your hand. Have you found yourself justified some days because your mate, what she did or he did, and you're feeling okay with the wrong, sinful behavior you've done towards them? Anybody? Yeah. And this is what I found in the middle of it. In the middle of the darkest time of my life, the only time I had peace is when I moved with him. When I listened to the Spirit of Christ and I invested and served in the way that he called me to. When Paul says God's desire for you, he's called you to peace, he means he's called you to peace in terms of living the life of him and you spilling out on everybody else that's around you. I didn't write this stuff. See, this can't be about whether I'm going to get divorced or not divorced, or married or not married. I'm to be a man that lives at peace. And let's look at this very last part of this, the whole idea then as we move along, and you'll see he brings all this together. The Corinthians ask, married or not married? Again, I remind you, some of them were saying that celibacy was more spiritual than being married.
And I'm just going to read the very first part of this passage for the sake of time. He says, but God has distributed to each one as the Lord called one, so let him walk. And so we're going to move right on for those that are working the computers for us. When he answers the question, when Paul answers the question, should I get married or not get married? And this is what Paul says. Yes. Well, no, but I ask you, should I get married or not get married? And he says, yes. He says, it doesn't matter. What matters is what God has called you to. Now, here's what I want you to see. The first part of this passage, it says, God does the distributing and he does the calling. Now, I'm not saying that God makes you sin. Everybody hears that, right? So if you do something boneheaded and it's sinful and you're reaping the consequence, you don't get to go to this passage and say, oh, well, hey, listen, God distributed where I'd be at this time and what I'd... No. That's not what happens. But the truth is God knows that you're choosing before you choose it. And he's going to let you choose. And when you choose, he's already committed to one thing. He who began a good work in you is going to complete it. He wants to bring you to the place of peace, married or not married, being a boneheaded or not being boneheaded. He's going to bring you to the place that he wants you to go, and the place that will be best for you. And he has called you to these very particular places. So he says being single's better. He says, honestly, there's a lot going on in our culture today. And I know you can identify with this. There's a lot going on in this culture today. And it's hard being married. There are some that think there was actually persecution going on, and they would use a husband and wife relationship to try to get them to deny Christ himself. But the other part of it is, anybody around here thinks that marriage is harder and harder, and the incredible assault on our lives and our minds and our hearts today? Anybody like that? It's difficult. And so Paul just says, hey, listen, I wish you were like me. He says, one, it's a difficult time to be married. But two, he says that marriage can, he's saying, here's where I'm at, marriage can be distracting. Well, can I get an amen? Except they were saying, marriage is so distracting. Some of them were saying, marriage is so distracting, I'll never have any part of it. Paul just says, listen, I have, at this point in my life, made a decision to move ahead in him. And so for me, this is the place Christ has called me to. But it's not better, because marriage is good, but it's very difficult. It's hard. But this is the place that God works. Secondly, in this marriage or not, I want you to be clear. I believe that Paul is making very, very clear that we're to be called, we're to move into him at the place we were called. Watch my lips. If you are here, and as I've been talking, you're going, man, I got divorced, and it was not for what the Scriptures allowed. Or I'm questioning now whether or not what I did was for what the Scriptures allowed. I want you to hear this. I believe Paul is screaming it. This is the place that you find yourself now, and divorce is not an unforgivable sin. And there are plenty of people that teach it, and there may be people here that believe it, but you better bring your A game, because I don't think you can support it from Scripture. Divorce is not an unforgivable sin, and it is not the thing that destroys your life for the rest of your life. I want you to get this, because God, in the middle of all that you may have chosen before, is looking for another way. He uses lots of examples in the passages. He talks about circumcision and slavery to argue this issue. He says there are people that think circumcision is a big deal, but he says get circumcised, don't get circumcised. There were people that were getting uncircumcised during this day because they thought it was more spiritual. He says it doesn't matter. He says not only that, he says slavery, it's wrong. And if you can get your slavery, then get it. I mean, if you can get your freedom, then get it. But the truth is, if you can't get it, that is not going to stop you from being the man or the woman that God has called you to. But then he says this, be a slave to no man and no woman, and we're going to close it up here really quickly. There have been times in my life when I've thought if I could just get to over there, if we were just in a better place, if I could be single, if I could be married. You ever heard anybody? Everybody that's single wants to be married, and everybody that's married thinking maybe single would be better. And we've all thought it. That's the reason it's funny, or we've heard it a lot. But here's what I want you to see. Yeah, you don't want to admit to thinking that. But here's what I want you to see. He's calling out to us to say, do you not get it? God has called you where you're at, and this is your place of revelation. So do not waste your time worrying about whether you're single or you're married, or you got this or you got that. And he even goes on and names some things like how prosperous you are and what you own. And at the end of this passage, this chapter, he says, look at all the things that are in the world. And he says, you should pretend like those things don't even exist, or like you don't have them. Because these are hard times. And your first focus, as James was talking about, your first focus has got to be to go after Jesus. I'd close with this. It's your place of revelation and expression. Now, this is kind of one of those things where there's specific conversations we're having about divorce and remarriage and intimacy and all those kinds of things like that. I'd be happy to expand any of those for you. And if you are honestly having questions this morning, please come and ask. But I don't want you to miss this. In the middle of all this brokenness, in the middle of all the difficulty of wherever you find yourself, it literally is your place of revelation. Don't go looking for it somewhere else. This is the place you've been called to. And that's why Paul says that you should walk in that. And as you have the revelation of Christ and you understand what he's calling you to in this place that you're at, it no longer becomes about money or not money, or where I can live or can't live, or what job I can have or what job I can't have. See, he makes the big point that what matters is the expression of Christ's life where I'm at right now. By God's grace, in the middle of my divorce, after losing my job at a church, as a result of all that, you've heard me say I ended up at the hospital being a nursing assistant. Nobody even knew my name. And they only called me when there was a mess. Here's what I've discovered. First of all, I discovered I was dreaming, first of all, about all the losses that had happened because of a broken relationship. And then I was grieving the incredible loss of what I saw as the dream for my life. And then I realized that in the middle of all that, there were things that God wanted to do in me and with me that may or may not ever having me in ministry ever again. You see, God knew the proud man I was, and he knew more than anything else, above any relationship, that pride would keep me from the incredible peace that he had to give.